favourite things to cross stitch on that isn't fabric is perforated paper. It can be really fun and add a lovely extra dimension to your stitching, but I know it can also seem a bit daunting. So across this series of videos, I want to show you how you can use perforated paper for cross stitch, share some tips and tricks to make it easier, and hopefully inspire you to try it out. Hi there Stitchy friends, I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you all the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can learn more about all things stitchy, grow your stitching skills and get the most joy from your stitching. I know there are lots of questions around cross stitching on perforated paper, and I'm really excited to share my experience with it and my best tips and tricks for using it. However, it is rather a large topic to cover in a single video, so I'm going to break it down into smaller chunks. In this first video, I'm going to cover what perforated paper is, how it compares with plastic, and answer various questions you may have about how to prepare it and what supplies to use. In future videos, I'll show you how to actually stitch on it, how to add beads, and different ways to finish it up. When I've created those videos, I will put them all together in a playlist about cross-stitching on perforated paper. So please do go and check that out if you're watching this video sometime after it was released in October 2025. I have always loved the finished results with stitching on perforated paper, and that's probably why I've designed several patterns that can be stitched on perforated paper. So you will see some of those popping up during the videos. You'll find links to the patterns I show and also to any other videos I mention in the description box. Let's start with a look at what perforated paper actually is. This is a sheet of perforated paper, and although it's called paper, I would say it's more of a very thin card, and it has a regular grid of holes punched into it. So we treat these holes exactly the same as the grid of holes on a piece of Aida, and cross stitch on it in exactly the same way. As I make this video, it does seem to be quite difficult to get hold of perforated paper due to manufacturing issues, but hopefully these will resolve in future. And of course you can still buy kits that contain perforated paper, or you may already have some in your stash. In the UK, I've usually bought it from Lakeside Needlecraft, so I'll pop a link to them in the description. I also see that 123 Stitch in the USA carry it, and they ship to many places around the world. Most commonly, you'll find it in 14 count. And I have only ever used this Mill Hill brand, which comes in A4 sheets. I'm not even sure if there are other brands available. The 14 count is available in white, which I have here, and also in a variety of different colours. And even metallic, like this silver. Now the coloured and metallic ones are painted, so the colour is only on one side. Now you can also get 18 count, which I've got here in comparison to the 14 count. And I really love the 18 count, but as far as I've seen, this is only available in white. In terms of cost, and based on the prices from Lakeside Needlecraft, a pack of 2 A4 sheets of white perforated paper is £6, which is pretty similar to roughly the same size piece of 14 count white Aida, which is £6.70. The packs of coloured perforated paper are a little more expensive at £8 for the 2 A4 sheet pack. One thing you may well have already noticed is how much bigger the holes are on the perforated paper compared with 14 count fabric. So these holes are much more visible even when there are threads in them. And the paper background can also be more visible underneath the stitching. So you may find you prefer to use more strands than you might for the same count of fabric for good coverage. On the plus side, the larger holes are very easy to see. At this point, you may be wondering how perforated paper compares with perforated plastic canvas, as that's another commonly available option. Plastic canvas can vary between brands, but it does tend to be somewhat thicker than perforated paper, which makes it more durable. And surprisingly, although it's somewhat less flexible than paper, you can still bend it more without risk of creasing or cracking like the paper. You can also buy plastic canvas from Lakeside Needlecraft in A4 sheets at £2 per sheet. Now the big difference here, which I think you can see, is that the holes in 14 count plastic are much smaller than with paper. And that can make it really tough to get your needle through them, especially with thread in there too, because there's really no give in those tiny little plastic holes. You may come across a thinner, more flexible plastic in some kits, and this may even have more of an Ada texture look to it. And you can see the holes are slightly bigger than this regular plastic sheet, although not quite as large as the perforated paper. In particular, I've come across this flexible plastic in magazine kits from the world of cross-stitch, but I have found it difficult to get hold of this anywhere else. Now, one difference between paper and plastic is that the perforated paper is more lightweight than the plastic, which can be handy if you want to put lots of layers together. Despite being made of thin card, it's not all that easy to tear the perforated paper, and even if you do bend it slightly as you stitch, it will flatten back out. And if you're stitching a design on just one layer as an ornament, then you may get a little extra sturdiness with using plastic over paper, but this is pretty minimal, especially if you back the ornament with card or felt. You can see how sturdy this is, and it's just backed with a couple of layers of cardboard. And a paper-based ornament will be lighter for hanging on a tree, for example. One big difference is when it comes to cutting out around the finished piece, as this is somewhat harder on plastic because it is a lot tougher than the paper. I personally don't enjoy stitching on perforated plastic, mainly because it's just physically harder to do because of the smaller holes, so I would rather use paper. But of course, the choice is yours, and pretty much all of what I'm sharing today is the same for stitching on plastic as on paper. When can you use perforated paper for cross-stitch? Well, firstly, don't go thinking perforated paper is a new thing, because it's been around for a long time. The Victorians were crazy for stitching on perforated paper and used it to make framed pictures for home decor, greeting cards, small tokens of love and friendship, and even trinket bowls. Lots of you will have come across it in kits, particularly from Mill Hill, such as this one here called Cozy Cabin. This one comes with navy blue perforated paper, as well as everything else you need to complete it. Kits like this are a perfect introduction to using perforated paper, so definitely worth trying out. Kits range from fairly small designs to much larger ones, and often incorporate beads. Perforated paper is great for beading, as it's pretty sturdy, so the beads sit really well on it. I mentioned I'll be talking specifically about beading in a future video, so if you don't want to miss that, then make sure to subscribe to my channel. I regularly release tip and tutorial videos on all sorts of cross-stitch topics, along with floss tube videos where I share what I'm currently working on. As well as full kits, you may find PDF patterns that are designed to be stitched on perforated paper, such as these ones from Satsuma Street that you can buy as kits, but also just as the PDF charts. Or this super cute owl from Mama Loves You GB. Now, once you're familiar with perforated paper, you'll realise that lots of patterns or parts of patterns can be stitched on perforated paper, even if they weren't specifically designed for it. For example, you could take the coffee cup from this design and stitch it on perforated paper, or the birdhouse from the centre of this design. If you are going to do this, then be very careful about the choice of design, and avoid ones with lots of intricate edges or fiddly details that could be difficult or even impossible to cut out at the end. I would also avoid designs with very detailed backstitch and fractional stitches other than half stitches. I will look at these in the next video, but at best they're difficult to do on perforated paper, and in some situations downright impossible. I mentioned that I've designed several patterns to use perforated paper, and the way I love to use it is by building up different stitched layers to give a fabulous dimensional effect. Here are some examples. This cute layered sheep is built from 3 layers. This tiny tea bag is 2 layers, but also has this separate little label. And these pretty pastel snowflakes can be made up of however many layers you wish, because they're stackable with mix and match layers. I almost always include a flat pattern version that can be stitched on fabric too. So for comparison, here's the sheep stitched as a flat piece and turned into a coaster. Hopefully you can see why I get so excited about perforated paper, because it really is fun and there are so many ways to use it. In fact, let's take a very quick look at the types of things you can do with it before we get into it. It's perfect for hanging decorations or ornaments, such as the snowflake and sheep, but also this tiny patchwork tree. You can make small motifs like these into pin badges, fridge magnets, like this love heart, or perhaps needle minders. How cute would this little sheep be as a needle minder? You can make cake toppers like this love heart design, and these love hearts are actually a free pattern on my website. You can also use it just to give a bit more depth to a design for a greeting card, such as this Get Well Soon card, or to a gift tag. Again, I've used the layered snowflake design. Okay, it's time to dive into some practical tips and preparation for stitching. Let's look at a few things that you might find it helpful to know before you start stitching and answer some frequently asked questions. Starting with, is there a right and wrong side to perforated paper? You may read that there's a right side and a wrong side to perforated paper, and this is technically true, but usually not super important. Now, if you have one of the coloured or metallic papers, then yes, the colour or metallic will only be on one side. So that's the wrong side, and this is the right side. And that's very easy to tell. But for white, it's not so easy. You may be able to feel that the right side is a little bit smoother, and you might be able to see or feel the edges of the holes on the wrong side, but honestly, it's pretty difficult to tell. And if you can't easily tell, then it doesn't matter. How do you hold the perforated paper for stitching? As I've mentioned, perforated paper is fairly sturdy, but it is still paper, so it is possible to rip it or crease it as you stitch on it, especially if you pull the thread very tight, as this could rip through the holes. Now, you don't need to put it in a hoop or frame to stitch on. So if this is what you usually do for stitching on fabric, then you might need to have a little play to figure out the correct tension for your stitches. I only ever stitch in hand, so it felt close to normal for me. And although you don't need to put it into a hoop or frame to stitch on, I know that some stitchers find it hard to hold in hand, and for some it may even be painful. So there are ways to put it into a hoop or frame. You can attach extra fabric strips on all four sides of the perforated paper, or just two sides if it's a small piece, and then put that fabric into a snap frame. Or you can tack it onto the middle of a piece of fabric in a hoop or frame, then cut away the fabric from behind the paper to leave a space to stitch in. There's also a fairly new and exciting accessory, which is the wooden magnetic frame. This can be used to sandwich your perforated paper between two magnetic frame layers, giving you something to hold on to. They do come in different sizes, but you will need to have your piece of paper be big enough to fit into it, which may mean cutting off and potentially wasting more around the edges. I suspect I might not enjoy these frames for the same reason I don't enjoy holding a hoop or frame, because it makes my hands hurt more than just holding the fabric or paper. But I will probably get one and give it a go, because you never know until you try. In the UK, you can now buy these from Talking Dog Stitchery. So pop over there to take a look if you fancy trying one out. Of course, I'll pop a link in the description. And you can use code CATKIN5 for 5% off any orders over £10. Next up, let's talk about needles. Firstly, I would suggest using the same needle type that you do for cross-stitch on fabric. So that's a tapestry or cross-stitch needle, which have blunt rounded tips. A sharp needle is not ideal because it could pierce the paper. And remember those slightly bigger holes in perforated paper compared with Ada? Well, this is what often happens when I use my go-to size 26 needle on 14 count perforated paper. It falls straight back out, even with thread in it. It's quite hard to get it to stick. If I push it really far, it might just about stay in there, but it's still going to fall out really easily. So I tend to go a little bit bigger and find a size 24 needle is great. So that's much more likely not to drop back out of the holes when I'm stitching. Now, many of you already use a size 24 needle for 14 count, so that's absolutely fine. On the flip side, you don't want the needle to be too big, as there really isn't any flexibility in the holes. So a needle that's too large could easily stretch or even tear the holes, especially once you account for the extra thickness that having thread in the needle will give. If I'm working on 18 count perforated paper, then that size 26 needle works really well for me. Let's talk about how many strands to use, and this is really a matter of personal preference, exactly as it is with fabric. On 14 count Ada, most people use 2 strands, so that would be the same for 14 count perforated paper. However, some people do like a little more coverage on 14 count fabric and would use 3 or even 4 strands of thread. As I've mentioned, you might find the coverage with the same number of strands does look slightly different on 14 count fabric versus paper. So this is 2 strands on fabric, and this heart on the left hand side is 2 strands on 14 count perforated paper. Now I generally do use 2 strands on 14 count Aida, but on paper I do tend to prefer 3 or 4 strands. And that's what I've stitched here. I've gone from 2 strands to 3 strands to 4 strands. Now many people will be completely happy with 2 strands, but you can see the extra density that you get in the stitches with 3 or 4 strands. There isn't a lot to choose between these with 3 and 4 strands though. In these stitched examples, I did use 4 strands for the snowflakes, but it is quite hard to stitch with and uses a lot more thread. So for the Love Heart sweets, I just used 2 strands, and in reality there's actually very little visible difference between these pieces, unless you look really closely. It might be more apparent when stitching with darker colours. I noticed that the Mill Hill Cozy Cabin kit that we looked at earlier suggests using 3 strands. Now, I tend to prefer 2 or 4 strands because I can more easily use the loop start. As always, it's worth testing to see what you prefer best, and you absolutely do not have to follow the given instructions or what anyone else says. Now for 18 count perforated paper, it might be a little easier choice because 2 strands gives great coverage, and I feel like 1 strand really isn't enough. And that's part of the reason I love it. Plus, everything is even smaller and cuter on 18 count. However, you might find 2 strands too dense and tight to stitch with on 18 count and may prefer 1 strand. Now let's run through some steps to take to get ready for that first stitch. And first up, it's cutting the paper to size. And the first, possibly obvious thing to say is that if you have a large A4 sheet of it, you don't have to use the whole thing as it comes. You can cut it down to make it more manageable if you're going to stitch small elements on it. You may be stitching a design that will be a whole square or rectangle, but you may also be stitching something that you'll be cutting out at the end. With kits, the perforated paper is already provided, so you will have to work with whatever margins they give you. If we look at the Mill Hill kit from earlier, the finished size is quoted as 7.6 by 6.4 centimetres. And this is the provided piece of perforated paper, which is 10 by 7.5 centimetres. So the margins are only 1.2 centimetres on each side and 0.5 centimetres top and bottom, which is pretty small. Now when cutting your own perforated paper, I recommend to cut a piece that's the size of your design, plus a small border. You don't need much of a border if you're going to cut close around the design at the end, but it can be useful to have about 2 or 3 centimetres on each side to hold on to. The other benefit to this is that if the edge gets dirty, it will be trimmed off. This is more important than you would think. Don't forget it's made of paper, so you can't wash it at the end. So let's use this tea bag pattern as an example. The main part of the tea bag is 25 by 20 stitches. So you could simply count this out on your perforated paper and add a few centimetres of margin by eye. So leave a few centimetres, might not even be quite a couple of centimetres, but that looks like enough, and then count 20 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 20, and then add another little bit of gap to there, and then that gives me the width of the piece I'm going to cut, and then I would do the same for the height, a few centimetres, count 25 stitches and add a little bit more. Alternatively, you can convert the stitch count to an actual size, which is 1.8 by 1.4 inches or 4.6 by 3.6 centimetres. If you'd like more help with converting stitch counts to actual stitched sizes based on fabric count, then do go and check out my video on this. So I'm going to add a margin of 2 centimetres to each side, which gives me 8.6 by 7.7 centimetres. So I would measure this and cut that out. So along the top, I'll measure my 7.7 centimetres and mark that on the paper. Let's go for that one there. You can see that's just a little bit longer than when I counted it by eye. And then 8.6 centimetres in the other direction is about there. So we'll call that the corner. I can follow along from there to there, and so I've got my marks there to cut out. So I've cut that piece out, and you can see how much margin that gives me. If I place the tea bag on top and stitch that in the middle, you'll see how much margin I've got around the edges. You can absolutely go for smaller margins than this if that works for you, or bigger margins if you want to make it big enough to put into a magnetic frame. You could even perhaps stitch this into the corner and stitch those little tag elements on the side as well. The other option, which is especially good if you're going to stitch a few small elements, is to simply cut a piece of perforated paper that's a size you're comfortable working with. And you could stitch all of the small motifs, like these little ice cream, all on the same piece, and just space them slightly apart with enough space to cut each one out. Similarly, stitching small elements like one of these letters on a piece of paper and giving it 2 centimetre margins all round feels like rather a waste of paper. But I also don't want a teeny fiddly piece to hold. So here I would cut a strip that's easily tall enough for the letters to fit on, with a small margin top and bottom, and then stitch the letter at one end. The strip gives me enough to hold on to while I'm stitching, but doesn't waste too much when I come to cut the letter out. And of course, I can stitch as many letters as I can fit on the strip if I need them. Do you need to do anything to prepare the edges of your paper? One great thing about perforated paper is that it doesn't fray, but you might find that your threads catch on the edges as you stitch. If this happens a lot and annoys you, you can trim the edge right up to a row of holes to leave a smooth edge. So you could trim it closer than I've done here. Or you could put some masking tape or washi tape around the edge, which I've already done on 3 sides on here. I'm just using washi tape, place it along the edge and fold it over. And that will protect your edges so it won't catch your thread now as you stitch. I hope that's given you some helpful background to perforated paper and answered some of the initial questions you may have, so that you are ready to dive into stitching on perforated paper in the next part of this series. If you enjoyed this video, it would be awesome if you could give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss a single stitch. And this will ensure that my tips and tutorials can reach and help more cross stitchers. If you're looking for more support from me and a fabulous community of stitchy friends, then I'd love for you to come on over and join my Patreon membership. You can find advice and inspiration and enjoy extra stitchy chat videos and regular live Q&As. Until next time, thank you so much for watching. Happy stitching, and bye for now.